Hello and good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Professor Jerome Delisle, Director, School of Education, and staff at the University of West Indies School of Education, as well as the Dean, Faculty, Humanities and Education, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which treats with the topic of equity-oriented assessment in an era of education recovery. So today is we present the first part of our webinar. It's our first webinar for 2022, following our successful run of webinars in 2021. And we are very pleased. We thank you for having participated and joined us in those webinars. And we hope that we will see you for the webinars that are planned for 2022. So this webinar that we have, which is focused on equity-oriented assessment in the era of education recovery, is divided into two parts. Today is the first part where we have 5 speakers, and the second part takes place on Wednesday, day after tomorrow, also at 4:30 p.m. So we trust that you have registered for both events and that you will join us again on Wednesday. So how we will be operating today, if you have been with us in the past, you know that our chat feature is the means through which you can interact with us. The microphone and video functions are disabled, but if you have questions and comments that you would like to pose to our panel, then you can use the chat feature. You type in your question or your comment, which will be taken up by our team, sent to me as a moderator, and I will then direct it to the appropriate person or persons for answer. So how we will be proceeding is that we will be going through our speakers who will be addressing means for getting our education system through the period of education recovery. We'll be looking specifically at the role of formative assessment as a vehicle, an efficient, effective vehicle in that process. Once the presentations are finished, then we will have a period of question and answer where we will be looking at your questions that you posed in the chat. So first off, we will be going to Dr. Freddie James, who's asking, what are some useful strategies for education recovery? Dr. James's topic, what are some useful strategies for education recovery? Dr. James is Deputy Dean for Graduate Studies and Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Education. She's lecturer in education leadership at School of Education. And she is Vice Chairman of the CARICOM team responsible for developing and implementing standards for educators and school leaders. Dr. James's research interests include leadership for and in emergencies, and building a parallel informal education system. So allow me to welcome Dr. Freddie James, who will take us through the topic, what are some useful strategies for education recovery? Dr. James.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sunarayan Singh. And welcome everybody. And it really is my pleasure to be here and to be sharing with you today. I'm going to move along because we have 10 minutes and I have more than 10 slides, and I usually say 10 slides in 10 minutes. So my area this afternoon really, is looking at strategies for education recovery. And when we talk about recovery, there's a sense in which we need to open this term up, because in the literature, you would find it means different things to different people. Here, I'm delimiting the meaning to education being a returning to a situation where you turn to a normal or returning to homeostasis. That's what recovery means. Or the process and actions required to regain a sense of normalcy or homeostasis. And from the graphic, you would notice that they both work in tandem. So the goal is to return to a state of normalcy or a state of homeostasis, and homeostasis here means optimal performance, which implies if you were not at a state of optimal performance before the pandemic, it means therefore you were not at homeostasis. So your goal is really homeostasis. It's not just getting back to normal. And the two work in tandem, as I said, because you have to organize the processes and the actions to regain that sense of normalcy or homeostasis. My thesis is that for us here in Trinidad and Tobago and generally in the Caribbean, we are really trying to achieve homeostasis, that optimal performance. So implicit in having a plan or a design for recovery, you want to know where you're actually going to be going. And for me, education recovery and planning for education recovery means transformation. Note I say transformation and not reform, because I see the two as two different things. Transformation is improvement and moving the status quo. Reform tends to maintain the status quo under the guise of change. So for this purpose, our purpose is here in terms of recovery. We're looking at transformation, and education recovery really means transformation. I'll get into that a little deeper. So I frame this evening's strategies, to look at strategies. What is undergirding any strategy that we may discuss this evening would be three things in my opinion: quality, equity, and policy. And further to that, in terms of quality relates to practice, what actually happens within the system, what happens in the school. And I've put a few ideas in terms of what that practice might entail: learner-centered pedagogy, new ways to assess learning, and having a relevant curriculum. In terms of equity, equity rests very, very soundly and foundationally on purpose. What is the purpose of education? And there might be the need to redefine the purpose of education to meet the needs of all learners, to empower stakeholders to participate in the redefinition process, not just to hold consultations, but to really empower stakeholders. So it goes a little deeper. And the third area, policy. Policy speaks to power, it speaks to agency, and nothing gets done unless you have the power to do it. And that power generally tends to be political power. It could be economic power, financial power, it could be moral power. But power is very, very important in any kind of transformation. So some of the areas that I've jotted down here, and there are more, but we can't go into everything this afternoon, is co-agency of learners and educators. Shared power, in other words. Multiple stakeholders in decision-making, not just consultations, but actually listening to what people say and feeling that they have a place at this table and following what they say, if it makes sense in the final analysis, but doing the thing together, in other words. And then greater stakeholder access to data, very, very critical. So while we have that foundational, that sort of theoretical framework that I showed before, in the education recovery refers not just to individual, which is like the school level and what happens in the classroom and so, but first the meso level, I'm calling the meso level the institutional, which can also include, in contexts like ours, the districts. And then you have the macro level, which is the broader societal level, the national policy level or international policy level. Even further, I took this from the OECD and Education International, 10 Principles for Effective and Equitable Education Recovery from COVID. They speak about a recovery ecosystem. And I find it's very useful. And this ecosystem includes at the core the students and families, very important, then the teachers, the schools and their communities, the learning environment and support, and then governments. So it's really is a multi-pronged approach to recovery and engaging a range of stakeholders. It's also multi-sectoral. We would know that from some of the recovery that we have started here in the Caribbean and here in Trinidad and Tobago. When I speak of transformation, transformation equals innovation. It means you have to innovate the pedagogical core, and you have to innovate at the macro level, innovate at the meso level, and innovate at the micro level. Otherwise, nothing will happen. This lovely present for the mathematicians say, it just wouldn't happen if you do not have innovation. So we are here at this point on the left side here where, you know, things are very thin. We haven't broadened, expanded the brief. We haven't expanded in terms of the depth of quality, equity, and policy. And how do we get to that other side where we want to be, where we have these beautiful colors from the prison just showing up? We together, we really have to engage the 4 C's of innovation: critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creative problem solving at all levels. And when we operate at all levels, it means therefore that we would be including the 3 levels that I showed earlier: the macro, the meso, and the micro. Here, this slide shows a number of different selected recovery strategies and models and so on. You have the UNESCO, UNICEF, and Education International. And one of the things I want you to pick up to note is that a number of these organizations came together to do their research, to be, and then to formulate a model or a policy. So even with the organizations, you are seeing that collaboration and that multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, multi-pronged approach to recovery. In the field, some people say learning recovery or education recovery. So I've put both up here. And there are links. The focus of this first UNICEF, UNESCO, and Education International policy is that teachers are at the heart of the recovery. The OECD and Education International of 2021, they have the 10 principles for effective, equitable educational recovery from COVID. I liked this particular one. I chose the Vermont Education COVID-19 Recovery Toolkit, which really focuses on the district level planning for education recovery. All of these you can just get online, find online. Then the World Bank had their open knowledge, which they did this big survey with a number of different countries to work out what was happening with them in the COVID and how they can reopen and how they can recover. You also had a World Bank, UNICEF, UNESCO collaboration that focused on quality and equity and given access. And then you had a CARICOM OECS, which is the one that I will elaborate on today, which is focused on learning improvement, recover, improvement, improve, their watchwords: recover, improve, transform. So I'll drill down a little bit in that in the short space of time that I have left. And the tagline for this one is Let's Reap. Again, collaboration, CDB, CARICOM, and the OECS brought about this model learning recovery and enhancement program. They have 10 main areas, but I like this particular diagram because of the diagram at the top, where you have the transformation intersecting with recovery and and improve. So if you improve, you transform, you recover. And you know, it's basically as simple as that. You have to act. And the 9 areas they look at is leadership and accountability, management and communication, regional and national partnerships, teacher support and collaboration, formative assessment, figure in very prominently, inclusion, SPED, well-being, resources and curriculum, parents and family, community and community organizations. Again, at the bottom here, don't miss this, children and young people, participation, student voice, learning. Being a part of the transformation process. And this next diagram about the curriculum learning recovery model, it shows the locations here, let's reap, and the 9 components on the side here, which is just more or less what I talked about. But look, I want to just highlight the location aspect for a little bit. Regional institutions and agencies. As I said before, that multi-sectoral approach. National institutions and national provisions. Schools, principals, teachers, children and young people, parents. Engagement with parents, families, and community. And again, children and young people, participation, student voices. That was a part of that slide that you may not have been seeing. And then this particular diagram shows more of the interconnectedness that this model speaks to. And the model actually has different aspects for principals, for teachers, and so on in greater detail. But if we look here now at the Caribbean, if we look at the Caribbean institutions and agencies, you have CARICOM, you have OECS, some of these, the Caribbean Development Bank, the national governments, UNESCO, UNICEF. At the national institution supervision, you have the ministries of education. So all of this is macro level. You have the Ministry of Social Care, you have Ministry of Infrastructure, Department for Curriculum Development, Department for Teacher Training, well, we call it professional learning now. Ministry of Finance. Again, you're seeing again the intersectoral nature. And then you have schools, principals, teachers, children, and young people, parents. Of course, you'll have the principal, you have teacher, and note you have specialist teachers, because this would be very important in terms of providing for the needs of all students, the inclusivity. And at the 4th level, you have the community. So here we would be really at the 3rd one really speaks to the individual, that micro level, what takes place in the school itself. And then you have community organizations, parents, community organization, church, sports clubs, which are the stakeholders that the schools will have to interact with within their school community. But at the end of the day, no matter what strategy you implement, what strategy you choose to use, which strategy you like, the real strategy is delivery. You could come up with all the beautiful models and plans and implementation, evaluation and monitoring does not take place, and you don't have that delivery, you will end up right back where you started. So stay positive, work hard, make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. James. So Dr. James shared with us a very powerful framework for getting transformation as opposed to reformation done. And notice that she connected transformation with innovation, and she gave us a powerful model for ensuring that every learner succeeds. So that using that model, notice that we want to reiterate the fact that it is a complex model that operates at several levels, and that we will have to bend our efforts at those levels and through what you call the multi-sectoral partnerships to get this recovery, get us on the road to recovery. So thank you very much, Dr. James. We move now to our second speaker, who is the Director of School of Education, so Professor Jerome Delisle. pardon me, is Professor of Education and Leadership and current Director in the School of Education, UWI St. Augustine. Professor Delisle's core specializations and training include educational measurement, assessment, and evaluation. And Professor Delisle will be talking to us today about from efficiency-oriented to equity-oriented assessment. Is the Caribbean ready? So his presentation will be looking at the ways in which assessment must be supportive and empowering for the learner as we move from colonial times to a more modern education system that is responsive to learners and their needs. So I invite Professor Delisle now to make his presentation from efficiency-oriented to equity-oriented assessment. Is the Caribbean ready? Professor Delisle.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I know it's difficult for you. It's the evening, and this is like a hard class, so I'll try to make it as simple as possible. I'll just talk over my slides, and I hope I talk very, very quickly. So we have some new terms here: efficiency-oriented, equity-oriented. What am I talking about? Now, I'm a measurement person, so in fact, I love tests. Give me a test every day and I'll do well and I'll come first and I'll go forward. I believe in tests. I love tests. However, you can't run a system entirely with tests. And that's my whole story. I can end my slides here. You really have to use assessment in a different way. And when you look at systems, basically you have a choice between a system that can sort and select properly. And when I say sort and select, I don't mean based on ability. You could sort and select on for other reasons, as you realize as well, who you want, who you don't want. You can have a system that is designed to measure accurately. We call it a measurement-oriented system. And that's what we go to US and UK to train for. We don't have that, I'm suggesting to you. And then we can move towards an equity-oriented system in which we use assessments to help others learn. I think one of the problems is that, you know, using the words of C.V. Gocking, we wondered and we admired the British, and they gave us this system. Now, our system was a plantation economy. There were few jobs in civil service. There was a lot of jobs to work, and so the system had to be efficient, had selected who was the best. And did it select who was the best? So when I look at the work that these men do, you're seeing two of the men, or three of the men, Eric Williams, Sarah James, Lloyd Best. Yeah, they were extremely intelligent, intellectual, and deep reaching. Although these systems and our system can separate people, they separate people based on not ability. Do not think that because somebody didn't do well in the common entrance, they are not bright. If you think so, they will come and rob you, fool you, and you will lose all your money, even though you have all those academic qualifications. It was not measurement oriented. The systems in the US are a little more measurement oriented. We use a number of techniques in order to understand how our items are functioning. The British, maybe less so. Look at some work last night, and they said, well, maybe we don't use complicated techniques like IRT. Well, that's up to the British. British can pick who they want. Of course, you know, this is fun, right? In the efficiency-oriented systems, it was about press and contest, about taking tests, about competition, about hiding your books. You still hide your books, right? Even Sir Vivian Paul, you know, he was in full contest mode, and as I I go through this some more, I realized that he was using some measurement rules. Because as you know, he made a mistake, what they claimed, I must say, they claimed he made a mistake in filling out his form. And that's why he didn't come first. Now, the year after, 1949, he worked in the QRC office. And so what he did, he copied down the scores of the students in 1948 and 49 that got the scholarship and he didn't. Mark, Byam, those were his competitors. And he realized he did better than all of them. He tried all kind of rules. We call them point rules in measurement to work out for, why. And he realized that there was no rule. That basically he came first. Not only did he come first, his fund was the best performance ever. So immediately realized that, things here weren't really just. And so many of our systems, because they're not very good, it creates a sense of injustice among people who are very smart. Let's hope we don't get too much people like that. Let's deal a little bit of measurement. I'm going to confuse you. There's something I've used in IRT. IRT stands for item response theories. Once in a maths and graphs in there. Basically, it tells us what information is carried in the test and where that test is located. So when you look at the CXC paper, where would that, what will give us the most information? Now, theory tells us that paper 1 with the breadth of content to give us the most information. And maybe paper 2 will be located, the TIF, the test information function will be located where the brightest students are. In fact, from all our understandings, the test information function is very high for paper 2, located in the middle, and paper 1 is very small. That tells you something about having an exam in which you claim you have items that are protected. Maybe people have the items. Maybe there are sites that people go up to and they get all the items. And if you repeat 60%, so let's continue. What we're striving for is a balanced, coherent, and comprehensive system. We're not saying, as some people say, well, just give them a little thing in there, a little music, and we're not saying that. We're saying that you need all the assessments, but you need to balance it, they need to be aligned, and you need everything. This is from one of the scientists in educational testing services who make the SATs. They have probably the most measurement scientists and the best in terms of my field. And they're saying, well, look, most of the day that's below, you should be doing formative assessment. So you saw formative assessment in CARICOM. I didn't read the CARICOM document. You see formative assessment here. You have to emphasize formative assessment. Formative assessment is being emphasized in Africa, in Europe, in Canada. So Trinidad not going to emphasize formative assessment. That's kind of crazy. And of course, the second level would be the performance assessment. And we have worked out that we should have that a little stronger in our system. But you still need the exams. You still need what they call the statewide assessments and the interim assessments. We decided that we don't want to know no national tests because schools feel very sorry about themselves. Well, okay, how do we do people are learning? We don't know. We just stop. So here we have a system where there are 5 types of assessments, and all you're concerned about is public exams, public exams, public exams, public exams. So they do the public exams, they write the public exams, they prepare for the public exams. That is not measurement oriented, and it's not equity oriented. How do we move towards equity oriented? Well, we need to forget about marks. What do marks tell you? Marks tell you what the student has learned. And if you didn't give them a chance to learn, then they wouldn't have learned it. It doesn't tell you that the person is a genius and brilliant and has talent. Even if they have talent, you have to develop talent. That's a little aggressive, right? And of course, the FPSI is the model. The FSI is what we encourage in terms of classroom assessment. It should be formative performance. It should encourage 21st century skills. which is so also in the curriculum document. Again, and that's what we have been encouraging since since I came back here. And integrated assessments. We think it can transform the system. We think performance assessment allows you to give feedback to Caribbean children. We think that you should have both tutor feedback and self-assessment. We think 21st century skills should be encouraged, and we think all parts of the systems will work together. Will you help us reach that goal of equity-oriented assessment? Thank you.
Thank you for that thought-provoking presentation, Professor Delisle. And I think that the line that stayed with me most was when you said that marks tell us, what the student has learned, but that if it is that we have not provided the opportunities for the student to engage in that learning, then essentially the marks are suspect, right? And I think what we also will remember is the diagram that shows it's the proportion of assessments that need to occur nationally, and that we ought not to be so obsessed with public examinations, but rather we need to focus our attention more on the equity-oriented assessments to ensure that our learners have a fighting chance in our system. So that was Professor Delisle speaking, pardon me, about from efficiency-oriented, which was a colonial model, to equity-oriented assessment, is the Caribbean ready? So we transition now to our third speaker, who is Dr. Carla Kronberg. Dr. Kronberg is a lecturer and head of the assessment committee at School of Education. She has had over 20 years experience as an educator within the secondary school system. And Dr. Kronberg's research interests include teachers' implementation and use of formative assessment activity in the classroom. So today, Dr. Kronberg will speak to us on the topic, why use formative classroom assessment as a tool in recovery. And in her presentation, what she essentially will be doing is advocating for a reimagination of teacher assessment practice to ensure that that assessment becomes a tool for education recovery. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Carla Kronberg with her presentation, why use formative classroom assessment as a tool in recovery. Dr. Kronberg.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sunarayan Singh. So Professor Delisle said something in his presentation, which I want to draw reference to. And he said that we need to think about using assessment in a different way. And I want to suggest to you that formative assessment is a great way to think about using assessment in a different way. So let's start with the beginning. What is formative assessment? Formative assessment is all those activities that the student and the teacher engages in that provides the students with feedback that allows them to know where they are going in those activities. The aim of formative assessment is to provide the student with information so that the student can successfully complete the task and engage in learning in a meaningful way. Formative assessment is a process-oriented activity that takes place during the teaching and learning process. When I think about formative assessment, I think about its 4 components, which are very distinct, but very interconnected and dependent on one another. The first is criteria. So I like to think about criteria as the rules which determine what quality is in a task. It tells the student what you need to do to complete the task. And some rules or some criteria are very simple. For example, write a 6-page essay. But some of the rules that we use when we assess a student can be complex and fuzzy. For example, this must be an original piece. And students often stumble and say, so what is an original piece? And making the criteria explicit tells the student what we mean and what quality is. As the student engages in the task, we collect evidence of where the student is going and how are they progressing. We ask them questions and we observe what they are doing. And in doing so, we are able to map their progress. And we do that with a purpose because we want to offer them feedback. We want to say, this is where you are at the task, but based on the criteria, this is where you need to be so that the student can adapt what he or she is doing so that they can complete the task successfully. Along the way, we want to involve the students in a meaningful way in the task. We want to give them opportunities to look at their work or the work of their peers and provide feedback to their peers and to provide a judgment of their work as to what it looks like, where it's going, and where it needs to be. So formative assessment involves students engaging in peer and self-assessment. When we talk about formative assessment, we often talk about formative assessment as it relates to a journey. So the questions we use is, where am I going? Where am I now? And how am I going to get there? I want to suggest another analogy to you. I like to think about learning as the journey, and we're going to get to development. And I like to think about formative assessment as the tool, or like I would say, the GPS. So recently, I was in Marval and I needed to get to West Mall. And I must confess to you, I am not a city girl. I am a country girl. So Port of Spain is unfamiliar for me and difficult to navigate. So what do I do when things are unfamiliar? I plug in Waves, and Waves takes me where I want to go. It's a journey that is filled with excitement. So I sat and I plugged in my destination, and it produced a map kind of like the one you see on the screen. And it showed me the route by pointing out the arrows. It gave me the direction in words as well as pictures, and it pointed out landmarks along the way. And that gave me confidence to engage in the journey, to start the journey, even though I didn't know where I was going. And for me, that's kind of like the criteria. The criteria is a roadmap that tells us where we are going, and it points out all the important stops along the way. And as you go along on the journey, Waves is collecting information. It is telling you, this is what you've done so far, and this is where you need to go. And that is like eliciting evidence. It is we as teachers collect evidence to tell students how they are progressing. But we collect evidence with a purpose, and the purpose is to provide students with feedback. So as I was driving along the way, we said in 800 meters, turn left. And then it said in 400 meters, turn left. And then it said in 200 meters, turn left. And before it finished the sentence, I turned left. And we've said, recalculating. And that is kind of like what feedback is. Feedback tells us what our strengths and our weaknesses are so that we could complete the task successfully. As I was driving, I pulled aside on the road because the road was a little unfamiliar to me. And I looked at what I had done and where I needed to go. And I said, okay, I know where I'm going. And I continued to drive. And that is kind of like the self-assessment, where we could look at our work and we could say, okay, this is what I need to do to complete the task successfully. The goal of me using Waves is to get confidence in my driving so I could drive as if I know where I'm going. And formative assessment does that in the learning situation. It provides the student with the confidence and the competence to complete the task successfully. I want to offer you 4 reasons for using formative assessments in your classroom, trying a different way. And the first one, it is a successful innovation. And it is a successful innovation in the way that matters to us, which is academic achievement. It is one of the most successful innovations of the 21st century, and it not only works with students who are struggling in school, but with students who have learning disabilities. Formative assessment works as a whole, or it can work, the parts can also work by itself to improve academic achievement. As Professor Delisle mentioned, several countries recognize the benefits of it and have used it in their policies for classroom assessment. We want evidence of learning, and we should ask for evidence of learning because we spend a lot of resources on education. And formative assessment provides us with that evidence, but it provides us with a particular type of evidence. Usually a test will give us a snapshot of what the student is doing. But what formative assessment does is that it provides us with a photo album, a variety of evidence that the teacher can glean through and get an accurate picture of how the students are going. A recent survey by the NWEA pointed out that what parents want is really want to monitor what their students know and is learning in school. And formative assessment could do that because it provides the evidence. It allows the parents to know what the criteria is, and through students' draft, they can see where their students are going. One of the things that formative assessment does is that it brings a different dimension to the learning arrangement. The teacher and the student work together to co-construct knowledge. And Dr. James talked about power sharing. And this is a moment for the student's voice to resonate in the classroom and use their experience and build on it to assist in them learning. Formative assessment allows for equity because feedback is given to students on their individual needs. So it's not one feedback for all students, but feedback per student on what they need to know to complete the task successfully. I want to point out the last reason for formative assessment is because it's versatile. It pairs well with a variety of things. We can use it with performance assessment, as Professor Delisle mentioned, to create an authentic experience. But we could also use it with summative tests. It's called the formative use of summative tests, and it's particularly useful in an exam-dominated culture where teachers can use such tools as peer assessment and self-assessment to correct tests. They can use formative assessment to help students prepare, and they could even do co-construction of knowledge by the students working to create test items. Formative assessment is not only good for knowledge, but it's excellent with skill development. And we want our learners to develop that 21st century skills. We want them to have the skills of critical thinking and problem solving and creativity and taking initiative. We want them to be in control of their emotions. And when we ask our students to engage in peer assessment, that's what we are doing. We're asking them to think critically, to manage their feelings so that they can speak to their peers in a manner that will assist their peers. We're asking them to collaborate. So formative assessment offers us the tools for that. As Dr. James mentioned, we want to be in a situation where we can recover. And in order to recover, we need to return to optimal performance. And formative assessment offers us the tools to do that in a meaningful way where our students not only learn, but they develop the skills that will take this country into generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kronberg. And I think that we will remember for a long time about the wonderful analogy that you presented us with of the assessment systems being compared to a GPS, where the purpose, pardon me, you said is we collect evidence with a purpose of providing feedback for improving performance so that students can complete tasks successfully. And I think we will remember that graphic of, and picture you using your ways to get to the ways up to get to the destination. So that was a very powerful analogy that you supplied us with, and you gave us some really powerful reasons why we should use formative assessment. So thank you, Dr. Kronberg. Before we move to the next speaker, let me remind all attendees that if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to pose to our panelists, please feel free to use the chat feature. You can type it in, and our team will send these questions or comments to the panelists. So we move on from Dr. Kronberg's focus on why use formative classroom assessment as a tool for recovery. We are going into a very specific and very contentious area, which is the assessment of reading and reading loss. So there is much debate. There's been much discussion about what reading loss has occurred and whether reading loss has occurred and how much of it has occurred. And Dr. Paulson Skerrett will lead us in discussing that. Dr. Skerrett is a lecturer in the area of reading, in reading education, at the School of Education. He's a reading specialist in the and member of the operating committee of the School of Education's Psychoeducational Diagnostic and Intervention Clinic, which is more familiarly known as PEDIC. So a main focus of Dr. Skerrett's research is in reading education, reading intervention for struggling readers. Many of you who tune into television may perhaps know him very well from his work in signing. So Dr. Skerrett today will speak to us on the critical role of reading assessment for struggling readers and for developing readers, and how we can go about ensuring that reading recovery occurs when students return to schools in full. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Skerrett, who will speak on the topic, assessing reading and reading loss in an era of reading recovery. Dr. Skerrett.
Good afternoon. So for over 100 years, this has been an issue. H.G. Wells, I've read a lot of famous quotes about him, but he once said, the examiner pipes and the teacher must dance, and the examiner sticks the old tune. If the educational reformers really wish the dance altered, they must turn their attention from the dancers to the musicians. And oftentimes, former forms of assessment, including reading assessment, have focused on the dancers, made the dancers appear to be the problem, when the issue has to be the musicians. And the solution, as Professor Delisle indicated, is not to outlaw the musical instrument. We need some of these instruments, but for us to change the tune with a concern for equity. And the concern still exists. So a lot of the current reading assessments, and they have been so for a long time, reflect the view that comprehension test individual discrete skills. And those items in the assessments can measure those skills. But really, those skills don't hold up psychometrically. And what we mean by that is that success on an item measuring a specific sub-skill of reading comprehension, like can student identify the main idea, those things don't hold on other items measuring the same skill, or even in realistic reading situations, which we hardly ever factor into our reading assessments. So that the conceptual distinctions between the reading skills that now appear even in the standards that guide, that's supposed to guide instruction and assessment, those do not hold up psychometrically. The individual skills can't be neutrally represented by test items, as students reading the item on a test may do so with a different purpose compared to reading for pleasure, for personal interest, for democracy. And then the funds of knowledge that learners bring to an assessment are going to be different and unique, their reading practices and habits in their various learning spaces. And then, as again, Professor Delisle made that point, reading assessment formats are often being driven by the need for efficiency, that the one-on-one reading assessments, the oral reading assessments that we have come to appreciate don't allow for. And of course, when school closure and we went online, that became even more critical. How are we going to do that? Because we don't have the students in front of us. But when we hold to that view of reading and assessing reading based on these discrete skills, what happens is that there's a decentering of things like criticality, deep understanding, and the multiple literacies. Since reading assessment is supposed to inform reading instruction, you find there's also going to be a decentering of criticality, deep understanding, and multiple literacies within classroom instruction, and we don't want that. So what's the goal? We want improved performance for all students, but particularly with a lens on traditionally marginalized student populations through optimal instruction, and the optimal instruction is supposed to be driven by the right kind of equity-oriented reading assessment. And that means revisiting things like authentic assessments that are complex and involve meaningful activities where students, things like their critical thinking is necessary, devising rigorous and authentic forms of assessment that involves tasks that prioritize ambiguity, problem solving, so that students take what is we can call a more agentic, affirmative relationship with reading. My pet peeve, and I love it, that's my pet peeve, is when I'm driving on the highway and I see that sign, keep left except when overtaking. That there's power in language. It's supposed to move us to action. So I do that. I keep left except when overtaking, and I realize the others who are not doing that, their literacy skills, the true power of their literacy skills just isn't there, and they clog up the highway, they lead to accidents, loss of life, all kinds of things. So equity-oriented reading assessment has to really test, can students really bring the understanding that happens, that the kind of transactional things that's happening with reading and affecting what they do, capitalizing on opportunities for teachers, the role of expert teachers who are expert assessors to observe and interact with students, these dynamic assessments that allow them to see what is happening with the students as they construct meaning and then step in and step back as needed. So we've had revolutions in reading assessment in the past, in the mid-1980s, driven by cognitive theory. So students were now getting longer text passages rather than those little snippets, more challenging questions, different question formats like multiple choice with multiple responses, because we're acknowledging that there could be multiple correct answers based on students' background, their funds of knowledge. Retelling, think aloud to get us to see the processing that happens while students are reading. And then in the 1990s, we made some steps forward. We had the sociocultural theories guiding our reading assessment. So we saw things like response to literature type questions, summarized, justify, explain, give some evidence, performance assessments in reading, reading portfolios, and of course, these social and cultural elements were there. And that's a critical thing if we're going to have equity-oriented reading assessments. That sociocultural conceptualization of literacy, because we have what are called multiple literacies. You have your home literacy, community, digital, what happens in the school, the academic space. I talked about the critical literacy, that relationship between language and power. Resource pedagogies, teachers who take into consideration students' funds of knowledge, they recognize, celebrate, and enrich that. And assessment needs to consider that. And then the fact that we have a multiplicity of literacies, both in what we teach and when we provide the assessment, those multiple literacies needs to be factored in because they are inextricably bound. So the resources of readers and their ability to flexibly use those resources, if assessments aren't capturing those things, to ensure that we need to do some more work with the students to get them where they need to be, then we would not be providing equity-oriented assessment. So what would this look like? What are some facets of authentic reading assessment that we are saying would be more equity-oriented assessment for reading? They need to emphasize that realistic complexity, stress depth rather than breadth involve the ambiguous, ill-structured tasks or problems. Tap into the funds of knowledge, reader experiences, their backgrounds. Encourage multiple routes to success, so not just these one-time snapshots. So while we would need these public exams, we can't probably do away with multiple choice items, but we have these various aspects of formative reading assessment that we can identify where students are. It should be process-oriented, so students need to be able to see during instruction opportunities for modeling, learner self-assessment, but also we should be able to in the assessment, determine that students have the ability to determine when they're doing well in reading. And so a rich, well-crafted performance assessment in reading, for example, will give us micro formative assessments and benchmarks along the way. Further on what this looks like, reading assessment should check for students being able to flexibly use reading strategies, that they could synthesize information in text, that they could come up with good questions and respond to those questions. They could bring their experiences to influence their comprehension of text. And it will involve designing items where students can orchestrate those skills which complement each other and flexibly use those various skills together. What would it look like for the readers when they engage in the assessment? They should be able to choose summaries that best represent text read, rate retellings that are more helpful to a particular audience and purpose, identify all the plausible, acceptable responses to a question, rate responses, are they complete, are they on track, off base? So notice critical thinking coming in there in the assessment of text. Assess prior knowledge, for example, predict whether certain ideas will appear, rate the relatedness of terms to a central concept of the selected text that they're asked to read. And there's a lot of rewards or benefits for doing this. So, for example, we'll find students having a more intimate, profound interaction with text. Students will get to read whole books instead of these cut-up passages that come for these evaluations. They would evaluate meaning instead of looking to see what one word in a sentence says about something else in the passage, passing words. You'll have expert teachers developing their skills as expert assessors, an emphasis on processes, and of course, tailoring the assessments to children's needs, tailoring instruction, based on this authentic assessment. So that's just a snapshot. So much more will be accomplished if we move toward equity-oriented reading assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scarrett. So that was a focus on the importance of using authentic, using authentic means and processes for assessing reading literacy. And Dr. Scarrett gave us some very useful measures, some very useful criteria and principles for ensuring that the reading assessments that are done in our schools will provide teachers with the kind of useful information that's required for ensuring that readers, our learners, don't get frustrated. So, and he started off, as you saw, with a fascinating look at the history of reading assessment from the cognitive to the sociocultural models. So we thank Dr. Scarrett very much for giving us some insight into how we can go about addressing the issue of reading loss as we move into the era of education recovery. So our next presenter is Dr. Corinne Louison, who will speak on the topic is there a role for psychoeducational assessment in education recovery? And Dr. Louison is a lecturer at School of Education, and she's also manager of the University of the West Indies Psychoeducational Diagnostic and Intervention Clinic, PEDIC. Dr. Louison has over 25 years of experience in psychoeducational assessment and diagnosis. And her research interests include psychometrics of assessment, test interpretation and diagnosis, individual differences in intelligence and achievement, and cross-cultural validity of psychometric tests. So today, what Dr. Lozon will be exploring and attempting to explain is how the educational disruptions brought about by COVID-19 can exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and even uncover invisible disabilities among learners. And therefore, what is it that needs to be done to ensure that we can offer support for learners who may be struggling and those vulnerable learners who may be struggling at this time. It's my pleasure, therefore, to welcome Dr. Louison for her presentation. Is there a role for psychoeducational assessment in the education recovery? Dr. Louison.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sunarayan Singh. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope my talk will be relevant and helpful to you in some way. I'm now going to share my screen, so if you just allow me. So as I talk about the role of psychoeducational assessment in education recovery, what I want to do is first start with an overview of the purpose and the function of psychoeducational assessment within the system of supports that are available to students who may be vulnerable. So we're speaking about vulnerable learners. Then what I'd like to do is extend the discussion to education recovery and speak about what research is showing to be the demands that the pandemic is placing on our system of supports. And then I will end with talking about where I see psychoeducational assessments fitting into that scenario. So a little bit about psychoeducational assessments. What is the purpose and the function of psychoeducational assessment? Now, when we think of psychoeducational assessments, we tend to think of it in terms of its diagnostic function, its diagnostic purpose. When a child is referred for a psychoeducational assessment, usually their parents or their teachers are concerned that they have been demonstrating some serious and severe challenges, whether it's learning, emotional, or behavioral, that seems to be impeding their academic progress. Usually, parents or teachers would have applied or would have attempted to intervene in some way to assist the student, but the attempts have been unsuccessful. So at that point, they consider that going for psychoeducational assessment would be the best approach. In the psychoeducational assessment, the psychologist uses a number of techniques, whether it is testing, whether it is interviews, whether it is behavioral observations, in a way of gathering data that would allow them to make some sort of statement, some sort of assessment or to ascertain what is underlying that child's current challenges. If they can identify what is underlying their challenges, then they're able to make a diagnosis. So psychoeducational assessments are regarded highly for their diagnostic utility. But psychoeducational assessments have another function, which I consider to be perhaps most important. And what the psychoeducational assessment does is, in that data gathering process, there's a gathering of information about a child's needs, about a child's specific strengths, about the kinds of patterns, the kinds of errors that a child may make in their work. And that information helps guide or lends to the development of very student-specific intervention strategies, what we know as an individualized education plan that can be implemented in order to help improve that child's functioning. Now, within the intervention process, we now go into the area of formative assessment, and Dr. Kronberg did an excellent overview of formative assessment. And the key to formative assessment in that intervention process is its purpose in monitoring student learning, in providing feedback to both the student and the teacher that will allow them to determine how the child is progressing with the applied intervention. The teacher and the students can then adjust their behaviors, adjust their learning activities, adjust the instructional methodologies so that they can optimize student learning. Now, this slide is again presenting that sort of simplified linear model, the process from psychoeducational assessment to formative assessment, but it's also making the distinction between psychoeducational assessment and formative assessment. The psychoeducational assessment provides information necessary for intervention planning, and then the formative assessment provides monitoring, it provides feedback to guide the intervention process. Now, we can expand on this model a little bit to show that you have a student who is now entering sort of this system of support, coming in with behavioral challenges that are severe, that are persistent despite intervention. And the psychoeducational assessment is now providing some degree of clarity, some degree of understanding as to what is really impacting the student, what is underlying these issues. And it guides now the process towards intervention. Once the intervention is occurring, there is a possibility that a child may return to that psychoeducational assessment. Now, as a standard guideline, children return to a reassessment after 2 to 3 years. And that is usually because children would have developed to a certain extent, there would be a lot of changes, and it would be appropriate at that time for reassessment to occur so that we can assess a child's current functioning, and we could also get a general sense as to how that child has been doing since the beginning of their intervention program. But there are other reasons why children may return to that psychoeducational assessment before those 3 years have elapsed. And one of the reasons why they may return is because they have not been responding to intervention. So we talked about the formative assessment as a means of monitoring the progress that the child is making during this intervention. But those assessments may reveal that there has been no progress. There's been stagnation in that child's progress despite the revisions and despite the modifications. Another reason why a child may return for a psychoeducational assessment is because some new needs have emerged during that whole process. So as an example, so we can see a child coming in with certain challenges that results in a diagnosis of a specific learning disorder, for example, let's say a specific learning disorder in reading. And that child then has a formal IEP. And as the IEP process proceeds, the child begins to demonstrate defiance in the classroom. The child may start displaying very aggressive behavior, violent behavior, mood swings, very extreme mood swings. Now, this is a new need that has emerged that does not necessarily fit the profile of a specific learning disorder. So now we need to have a new psychoeducational assessment sort of to get a sense as to why this child is demonstrating these behaviors. Now, what can happen, what can come out of that psychoeducational assessment is actually a new diagnosis, or there may be an additional diagnosis. But in either case, whether there's a new diagnosis, an additional diagnosis, it would mean that there'd be a significant modification or rethinking of the IEP. Now, I wanted to to emphasize that a key aspect of decision-making when we are thinking about whether we are going to refer a child for a psychoeducational assessment is one, we have to see that there has been a lack of responsiveness to intervention. So the child is not responding to the interventions that have been prescribed, or that some sort of new need that is unrelated to their primary diagnosis has emerged. So after I have talked about the distinction between formative and psychoeducational assessments, I want to move to that specific context of education recovery and the kinds of demands that the pandemic may place on our support systems. And then what I'd like to do is to then tie that to the question of when is it appropriate or recommended that students be referred for a psychoeducational assessment. So we know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate effect on students with pre-existing vulnerabilities. So some of these students have had their IEPs interrupted or reduced. And in other cases, the online format has just not been suitable for some students. For example, students with inattention or students with certain perceptual impairments or sensory processing disorders. The online format has been shown to be really, really ineffective when it comes to implementation of IEPs. And there are also circumstances where, in cases where children require academic support at home, their parents or their caregivers just do not have the training or the knowledge to be able to support those very specialized interventions. So what we find happening is that children are showing deceleration, they're showing stagnation, and they're showing regression in their academic academic progress. What we're also seeing is that some students are being faced with an exacerbation or worsening of their symptomology. So, for example, in children who have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, we're seeing a decrease in interpersonal and social skills. We're also seeing in children who have been diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, increases in restlessness and inattention. In fact, international studies are pointing to an increase in referrals for assessment of symptoms related to ADHD. So we're seeing increase in disruptive behavior, increase in irritability, restlessness, lack of motivation, and so on. And also, when we think about some of the things people have had to face as a result of the pandemic, issues related to social isolation, unpredictability, fear, experience of illness or hospitalization, and sadly, the death of loved ones, close family, friends, and other members in the community. We see children presenting with symptoms of anxiety, of depression, of post-traumatic stress. So these are all concerns that seem to be surfacing that is related to the pandemic, the school closures and the lockdown that international studies are pointing to. Another area of concern that has surfaced, and this is actually one that the data is still sparse, is still quite sparse, but the evidence is demonstrating some indirect impacts of the pandemic on early child development. So what we're seeing is that children who are growing up in low-income families are displaying delays in their verbal, their cognitive, their motor development. And that is usually related to sort of the lack of the kinds of factors, the kinds of variables that we associate with optimal early development, the kinds of development, the cognitive development, and those things that are necessary for later learning. So we're seeing issues there. But one striking area that is still being researched is with regard to children who have been ill with COVID, who have suffered from COVID-19 infection and who have been hospitalized. And what the data is pointing to is showing early evidence of lower global cognitive functioning, lower executive functioning, and lower working memory in those children. So the data, although it is limited at this time, is reflecting multifaceted and diverse impacts on children. And therefore, there is good reason to anticipate that students will be returning to our schools requiring a wide range of specialized supports. Now, the situation is this, that we already have children with IEP who are suffering due to the interruption of their IEPs, but we are now having to brace for new referrals. Children who had not demonstrated certain vulnerabilities prior to the pandemic are now showing up with a need for some sort of assessment to determine what is happening with them, why they're having these challenges. And so the question is for our support systems, and this is the challenge, how do we provide these supports to all these children, but in a time-efficient manner and also resource-efficient manner? How do we utilize our resources efficiently, knowing what we're dealing with? And where do we expect psychoeducational assessments to fall within this context? So in the last last minute or so, I would like to focus on, as priority, students who currently have an IEP and will be returning with learning gaps or returning with new symptomatology or even exacerbations of their current symptoms. So as a first step, it is important for practitioners, for teachers to ascertain where is that student in terms of their progress on their current IEP. Are we seeing progress despite the school closure? Are we seeing gaps? Are we seeing losses in learning? Based on that information, we can work on readjusting, we can work on realigning their educational plans to meet them where they are at this point in time. Then we can monitor through formative assessment how they're responding to the restructured intervention plan. So that is the first step. We know that there are going to be circumstances where, for many reasons, the losses and the gaps in learning and the changes in the behavior are going to be severe. We know that there's going to be regression. So a child is going to come back in worse off behaviorally, worse off emotionally, or they would know less academically than they did before they were referred. Should we schedule that child for a psychoeducational assessment? So I want to say here that though one could understand how intensely worrying a situation like that will be, and one would feel the urge to seek a psychoeducational assessment, we still need to ask, how has this child's underlying needs changed? Right? Is it a result of the situation? Is it a result of the change in environment, the change in format of learning? Or is it something new? So the way we can rule out that, the way we can answer that question of whether this child's needs have actually changed is to allow time to determine how effective these resumed and realigned services have been at making up the losses before making decisions about whether to refer for a reassessment. If it is indeed determined that the students' needs have changed or new issues have emerged that are not related to the disruption in the IEP, then I would recommend an immediate referral for a psychoeducational assessment. There are other issues that if you would like to get more information on, such as the new types of referrals and potential risk of diagnosis in children, I'd be happy to answer questions about that. But I just want to say before I close that what the pandemic is revealing to us is the impact of challenging circumstances on the presentation of symptomology. And so we know that one of the things that I think is a very important area of discussion is how demanding circumstances, how challenging circumstances can impact children who presented before the pandemic with sub-threshold levels of disability. So these are children who may have had sub-threshold levels of symptomology, or may have certain vulnerabilities for certain disabilities, who would not have been picked up by the system, suddenly demonstrating these symptoms because the demands of the pandemic have increased or taxed their capacity to cope. And so we do need to take a look at these children and provide them the supports that they need. That's all that I think I have time for. I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope that what I said has been helpful in some way. And I now hand you back over to Dr. Sunarayan Singh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Louison. Unfortunately, you have the dubious honor of having presented us with the most frightening scenario of all the presenters so far, because unfortunately, the realities that you sketched out for us, and the role of psychoeducational interventions, as well as formative assessment in creating more mentally, socially, emotionally comfortable futures for children. They speak to a condition that the pandemic has produced, and that is it is a very, very scary scenario going forward. We hope that teachers and educators in general who are listening in, that you take up Dr. Louison's invitation, that you can contact her and contact the staff at PEDIC, which is the School of Education Psychoeducational Diagnostic and Intervention Center. You can feel free to contact PEDIC if it is that you need expert professional assistance in treating with as Dr. Louison said, the symptomology that you will see presented when the children return to school. These kids have been out for 2 years. March will make it 2 years that they've been out of school, and we have no way of predicting what's going to happen. But the School of Education's PEDIC arm is available. The expertise resides there, and we invite you to contact them if it is that you feel that you are in need of that level of expertise. So we are at the end of our presentations, and many of you in the audience, listening audience and viewing audience, posed some questions for our panelists. So now is the question and answer session, and I would, on your behalf, like to thank all of our panelists for the time that they took to put together their presentations. And now we're going to put them on the spot a bit. So we'll be starting with Professor Delisle. So the question to Professor Delisle, first off, is, can you comment on the CAC, which was tried in primary school in the context of an equity-oriented assessment? Also, why couldn't it work? Additionally, how can equity-based assessment or formative assessment realistically contribute to the SEA exam, right? So the person who wants an answer on why couldn't the CAC primary school work, and how can an equity-based assessment system contribute to SEA exam? Prof?
That's cool. So I need you to do a matrix thing. So you're in a matrix. So right now, we are all in a matrix in which our minds are focused upon exams. And I am asking you to get out of the matrix into formative assessment. The answer is not to say, well, we'll do formative assessment with the exam, which is what Professor Stafford said, CXC. That is not the answer. Formative assessment, as in England, who also loves exams, and no, these societies love exams. They focus on formative assessment purely. Hong Kong, they love exams more than you. And they just beat up exams. They're probably second or third in the world in terms of PISA. The Hong Kong Examination and Assessment Authority, there's a whole program in which teachers focus only on formative assessment. So we cannot connect formative assessment to exam. Why not? Because students are not silly, they are agents. So they realize that, wait, you mean when I do this, this will determine whether I will go to St. Joseph Convent? Well, how much marks I get it? So immediately the whole purpose is shifted. You use an assessment that fits the purpose. And when you're trying to select people or place people, if that's what you want to do, you use things that are precise, that are accurate. There is no way that we can make performance assessments accurate. I know you're going to get angry, but I come from working in a medical school. So I helped design the first 2003 system. 2003, that was the class of 1998 system, the new system. In medical school, we use performance assessments all the time. But you cannot create a national system based on performance assessments. The closest would be Vermont, the closest would be Queensland, and in Australia, and they cannot achieve. So how do you want us to achieve? We tried our best with the CSC. That's not my idea, but of course I help everybody, all governments, everybody, and we couldn't make it because administratively you have to have a score for everyone. Let me give you just one scenario with the CSC. Suppose my teacher didn't want to put all their marks in. Suppose she wasn't there to put the marks in. Does that mean I'm not getting my placement because of my teacher? All of those questions you have to answer because you must be fair to everyone. It's a little long answer. I hope it didn't confuse you, but thanks so much for the question.
Thanks for that answer, Prof. So we are on to Dr. Scarrett. Question for you. Can you please show us what an example of an authentic equity-oriented assessment would look like?
Well, in the presentation, I actually identified some reader tasks that smack of authentic reading assessment. For example, giving a student a piece of text and asking them to maybe visualize, tell us what they're visualizing, verbalize that, and then having some higher order questions that look at their ability to make applications to real world based on the things that they would have visualized and verbalized, ensuring that in their verbalizing, they've captured the main ideas. So those are some examples. Checklists for, so example, if a child is doing a think aloud, you can have a checklist for some of those high order thinking processes, those 21st century skills we talked about coming out as they interact with the text that they're reading. So those are some examples.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Dr. Scarrett. Dr. Kronberg, question for you. Can Dr. Kronberg comment on the reliability of formative assessment scores in the educational systems in Trinidad and Tobago? I don't know if you can answer that. It asks you to comment on the reliability.
So reliability of scores relates to the consistency of the scores. So meaning that if we retest the students, that we would generate consistent scores. What formative assessment does is that it promotes mastery of learning. The student is able to complete the task successfully. And so we need to conceptualize reliability in a different way when we are talking about formative assessment. We need to look at whether or not we are producing mastery in learning where the students can consistently master the content. And I think that formative assessment does. The nature of it allows for that kind of mastery. There are persons who are looking at the reliability of formative assessments, and they are looking at it in terms of instruments, and their research is interesting, and they talk about the utility of the instrument, the CAPTIA. But what we want with formative assessment is that learning, that the student being able to confidently own their work. And that's what's important. So we need to think about reliability a little differently, not in the way that we would think about it in terms of traditional testing. But yes, it definitely can produce that consistency of scores that we want. I hope I answered your question.
Well, let's keep you on the floor. And given where you just ended there, someone wants to know, why don't teachers want to use formative assessment?
Well, I don't think that they don't want to use formative assessment. I think that teachers could be excited about formative assessment, just as the panelists here are. We do run a course here at the university on the practice of formative assessment, where we use the FSI model, and our teachers are very excited to use it. I think it's difficult to implement new practices because we are forced to reflect on our practices and to adopt something different. And developing new habits can be difficult. I think that with the right support, that teachers can get very excited about formative assessment. One of our students from our last cohort, she said to me in conversation, she said, I thought I was a master teacher until I tried formative assessment. My students were so excited in classes, they just ran with it. They wanted to renegotiate the criteria. So I had to rebuild my assignment for them to get more involved. And I think that once teachers get their feet wet, of course, there's going to be challenges, but I think that there's possibility there. So I don't think necessarily that they are reluctant. Maybe they don't have the support, or maybe other things prevent them from using it. But what we want is teachers to use it in a very intentional way to create environments that can create learning for all students.
Thank you for that in-depth answer there, Dr. Kronberg. So question for Dr. Louison. Says, can you give any figures for any of the last few years on the number of students in Trinidad and Tobago who receive government-funded psychoeducational assessments? So the question is asking whether, in terms of students who receive government funding for psychoeducational assessment, if you have any figures on the numbers.
Okay, thank you for that. No, I don't have figures on that, and I know that hopefully those figures will be available. I am also interested in figures of how many students will be coming back in to regular schooling, requiring those services within the public system. I anticipate they're going to be large, and the question we should be asking is, relative to the number of students who require those services, what percentage of them are actually receiving those services? I know that the capacity is not there, and we need to think of ways by which we can offer those students who do not have access those very much needed services. So that's an excellent question, but unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's understandable. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Scarrett, question for you. Says, are teachers who really are generalists at primary school and specialists at secondary school, so are teachers able to handle reading assessment and the remediation that may be needed?
Well, there will be when they come and do the Masters in Reading Education at the School of Education is going to offer. So we'll encourage teachers to take advantage of that opportunity, because formative reading assessments is one of the things we're going to be looking at there. So with formative reading assessment, it's a new way of thinking, but as Dr. Kronberg explained, there's so much excitement because of how tied it is to the ability to apply reading to realistic situations, making very exposed all those thinking processes and getting children to really realize that reading is such an important part of life that can make a difference in the quality of lives that they live. So we encourage the audience and all teachers to look out for the Masters in Reading that the School of Education, the University of the West Indies, is offering.
Thank you for that free advertisement, Dr. Scarrott. Much appreciated. All right, so let's move back to the director. Professor Delisle, question for you. When is the Caribbean Examination Council, I don't know if you can answer this one, but when is the Caribbean Examination Council going to embrace formative assessment? It is all well and good for us, the teachers, to use formative assessment in the classroom, but then the children are still doing a paper and pencil test. So the person is drawing a reference to the lack of congruence between what they're doing and what the examination council is doing.
Yes, right. Well, that's wonderful. And I agree that Paulson that sound like a salesman. That was like, okay. I just need to give an answer as well to the question which was directed towards Dr. Kronberg. One of the goals, and hopefully, I mean, before I leave here, would be to help our people get trained in measurement. When you're trained in measurement, you become like Neo, and you see things that people don't see. So for example, let me use an example since I know you well. A writing assessment. It's not reliability. It's not test reliability. There are a number of sources of errors. The prompt, the task, the persons, the raters, even the nature of the rubric. They're all sources of error. So in fact, we talk about generalizability instead of reliability. And you have to measure all those sources of error in order to find out if it is functioning. So that is why measurement people, we don't suggest that you could use comfortably essays and get an accurate score without all of those measurements. So that's something that the Caribbean, we're trying hard. We don't have resources, but we taught that the first time this year. We're going to try again sometime. Okay, CXC is wonderful, but CXC is not the body to encourage formative assessment. Formative assessment, and that's very clear, and the ministry understands that, is done by the curriculum division. They are the ones who have the, because formative assessment is in fact part of the strategy for enacting the curriculum. In fact, it comes with the PCR. They had consultants, paid consultants. So I do 2 and 3. Paid consultants who will have helped them. Of course, they were from Canada. That's excellent. All right. So formative assessment is something completely different. School-based assessment creates, people in the Netherlands ask me, I don't know why they ask me that. It creates tensions because the person is doing formative assessment and you tell them, I'm going to go slowly again. Son, could you do this better? But how much marks I get? You mean this mark will determine if I get an A or not? Well, miss, if you don't give me marks, I'll have to last year. Okay, so it creates a tension. You are put in a high-stakes situation and telling students to make progress. What we want people to do, sorry, not bad English. What we want people to do is to use formative assessment in their classes, independent of high stakes, independent of marks, and learn. You know, coaches use formative assessment, right? If you want somebody to bat like the great Brian Lara, you don't immediately tell them, well, if you miss the ball, I'll punish you. What you do, you show them, you build on them, you give them feedback as Dr. Kronberg talked about, and then as they build the strategy, one day in an examination situation, they will make 100, just as Brian used to do. So formative assessment is the way that we reach the testing situation. You can't reach there by going on the board and saying 1 and 1 is 2. You go there by working with the children, and you carry the kids there.
Thank you for that answer, Prof. So, but I need to keep you there and ask you a hot potato question. Since you were talking about curriculum division, somebody has asked what sounds like a political question here. So here goes. It says, curriculum division seems obsolete in reading assessments based on what they share with schools. For example, with the ministry's STARS/remedial classes program. Is there a need to revamp what they advocate for assessment? And if so, how? I don't know if you want to take that question.
Yes, and I'm sure Paulson will be able to come in. I want to say we have one of the best, we are blessed by God, right? One of the best reading groups. They took about, what, 20 or so persons trained with the MED, and they've kept, they're close to 10 of them. They are experts, MED persons. We use the same people that they have. Of course, we train them more, and so they have great capacity. So I will go with them. I know that their heart is in it, and I'm very, very proud of the curriculum division. It's not about a division. It's about how we see assessment and learning. It's about what the administrators and the thinkers and the big people understand how to move a system forward. If you think the only way to move a system forward is to get tests and tests and tests and more tests, of course I love tests, you're not going to focus on formative assessment. But all I'm saying is it's becoming too late. You have formative assessment in Africa, formative assessment in Europe. Trinidad cannot be that far behind. So we're not going to blame anybody. There is no blame in love. We work together for the love of the children.
Excellent answer. I think you answered that political question quite well. Thank you. So, Dr. Scarrett, this is a follow-up question to the, remember you had made some suggestions about how to enact authentic equity-oriented assessment in the classroom. So this other question, I'm just going to read the last part of it, asks, can you suggest authentic equity-oriented assessment with which weak readers can feel completely comfortable? So the emphasis here is on ensuring the comfort level of weak readers when they are being assessed. I don't know if you can address that, please.
So I think the person who asked the question might have been reacting to one of the tasks that I suggested, where students were given a number of summaries, and then they asked, based on the text read, to choose which is the most appropriate summary given a particular audience, particular purpose for reading. And they were thinking, if a child is a weak reader, then how are they going to be able to make sense of all these summaries and pick the right one? But of course, in the age of technology with multimodal representation of text, we have different modes of representation, whether it's graphic, it may be video segments that can be given. And if students are weak readers, then those multimodal representations could be used to allow the students to demonstrate the same competencies, but you're just simply using a more appropriate mode until the student can get to the point where their vocabulary and their ability to engage with written text that may be more complex would allow them to successfully demonstrate the same set of objectives that you have in mind.
Right. I think that was very clear. Yes. Thank you so much. So we have a question for Dr. Kronberg, which is, wouldn't implementing formative assessment be time-consuming for secondary school educators? Dr. Kronberg?
Well, yes, it can be time-consuming. It requires that teachers do things differently, and simply to learn how to do things differently consumes a lot of time. But we could work smart. The beauty about formative assessment is that it happens within learning. So it is about making the criteria explicit. It is about providing feedback, which we do in our classrooms, but formative assessment allows us to be intentional about how we do it. So it's not a moment in passing, but it's creating moments of meaningful learning. And what it also does is that it allows students to become owners of their work. And so the time we would spend teaching, students could also participate. So they could be the ones who provide feedback. They could be the ones who help us develop the criteria. And what we want is when learning takes place, that it is enriching, and formative assessment allows for that. We want quality in our learning. And this is at the heart of formative assessment, to get that quality where the student feels competent and capable, where the students can dialogue with you in a meaningful way that contributes to his or her learning. So yes, it can be time consuming, but it's worth it. And if we are intentional about doing it, then there are things that we could do that would help with it being such a time consuming endeavor.
Great answer, Dr. Crumble. Thank you so much. So we have a question for Dr. James, Freddie James. And it goes like this. The point of transformation came up, which I totally agree with. However, how do we involve the policymakers in this process? Because our current curriculum does not facilitate learner-centered pedagogy. Where's the room for this change? I believe we need a total revamping of the system. So Dr. James, you had proposed the whole business of transformation and the need for innovation. So this person is asking, how does one involve the policymakers? And they're claiming that the curriculum does not facilitate learner-centered pedagogy. So where's the room for the change? Dr. James?
Thank you for the question. Just to start with, I would like to say that unfortunately, I disagree that at the moment, the current curriculum does not facilitate learner-centered pedagogy. And I say that because the curriculum itself is really broad. It's all encompassing. It encompasses the space for learning. It encompasses the content, the relationships within that space, etc., etc. And for persons who have undergone professional learning and preparation to teach, the focus of that preparation is on learner-centered pedagogy. And we have trained many, many people from the School of Education, and we have examined curriculum. Remember, curriculum is an active document. It's a live thing. It's not something that is static, that you take and you follow to the letter directly. It's something that requires interpretation, contextualization, and it is a cultural kind of document as well as a political kind of document. So that it is the curriculum is not done to someone. It's not on you, given to you. The curriculum is something that you accept and that you interpret and that you implement accordingly in a dynamic kind of way. So I just wanted to get that out first. How do we involve the policymakers in this process? I like how you put that, because it really shouldn't be we involving the policymakers. It should be the policymakers involving us. But to get this done, we really would have to use a different kind of approach, in the sense that we would have to be more collaborative, and we would have to agree on a purpose. And the policymakers may not always be the ones who would initiate the action that would bring about this kind of collaboration or the kind of transformation. It can happen from us at the university, and these webinars that we engage in and all the professional learning that we do is actually geared towards that we are in partnership with the schools. We're in partnership with the Ministry of Education. And through that synergy, we hope to be able to have an impact on the system and impact also on individuals. So I hope that answers your question.
I trust it will, Dr. James. That was a very thorough answer. So before we invite Professor Delisle to answer the next question, I just want to reassure persons who are present today. Once you registered for today's webinar, then you are also registered for the one on Wednesday. So you will get a reminder via email, whatever email address you registered with for today's webinar, you will get a notification in that same email address for Wednesday's webinar. All right, so you don't have to register again for Wednesday's webinar. However, if you have any friends or relatives and other persons who are interested in this topic and they have not yet registered, then we encourage you, invite you to ask them to register for Wednesday's session. I believe the link is in the chat. So do encourage your friends to register. We have, as you see, over 140 participants, which is very encouraging for our first webinar for the year. So our question for Professor Delisle, you've been asked to speculate a bit, Prof. Will we ever be able to create an educational model similar to what is in Singapore or Finland when it comes to alternative assessments? Asking you to kind of look into your crystal ball there.
All right. Well, I mean, the term alternative assessments means alternative to pen and pencil tests, and this is not what we're saying. We're talking about exams for different purposes. So comparing exams to classroom assessments, and classroom assessments should not look like exams. We are suggesting that locally, classroom assessment should make good use of performance assessments, and you can call that alternative assessment. So that's the model that we are encouraging, because we want to focus on in the classroom on making children learn before we test. I have changed a lot because of the amount of years I've been in this thing. I'm talking like those old men, right? Singapore, they love tests too. They just decided last 2 years they're not going to move their 11 plus. It's called the primary school exam, PSC, whatever. And it's one hard exam. Nobody can pass it. Okay, so they decide they keep it. But when you go into the classes, they use formative assessment. In fact, I'm not talking about Singapore because Singapore is Singapore. They were able to borrow, they admit that, they borrowed the theory and they borrowed the practice. But when they borrow, they build back better, which is the title of our next exam. They use it very efficiently. And so what they designed in formative assessment is now a model. But they use formative assessment in secondary school. So why are we only concentrated on pen and pencil papers, not only in exams, but in the classroom too? So there's nothing stopping us right now. And by the way, Singapore would be 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 in all the different action systems. From using performance assessment, it makes the curriculum live. It makes it exciting when you could not just, when you could do. So please explore, invite all others to come. I think the capacity is 1,000 people, and we want that. We want you.
Thank you very much, Professor Delisle. So we are into our last question now, which we will address to Dr. Skerritt. And before we get there though, pardon me, I just want to make a plug for our next webinar, not our last webinar. We have many more webinars to come for the year. So as I said, once you registered for today's webinar, you're also automatically registered for the next one. And just to inform you, perhaps whet your appetite, the fact is that the things that we've been talking about today regarding the absolute need for formative assessment, in our next webinar, we will actually have teachers, classroom teachers, who have had experience using formative assessments. So they will be sharing those experiences with us. So it's so that you get a sense that it's not just something that's out there and theoretical, and it's in textbooks and journal articles, and we're talking, we're talking very theoretically in abstract terms, but that we will be bringing in the next webinar actual teachers who have been using formative assessments and have had very positive experiences with it. So we invite you to tune in to that next session. So question for Dr. Scarrett, and this is the last question we'll be taking today. The question goes like this. Authentic reading assessment seems to be focused on deriving deep meaning from text. Is there any place for skills at the word level? For example, phonics/word recognition in reading assessments. The question again, authentic reading assessment seems to be focused on deriving deep meaning from text. Is there any space for skills at the word level, for example, phonics to word recognition in reading assessments? Dr. Scarrett?
Yes, certainly. So I agree with the initial premise, but for example, one formative assessment that you can use something called retrospective miscue analysis, where you have students read into some kind of instrument that records their reading, and then they listen to it back and they identify some of the miscues. And when, for example, there might be mispronunciations and because of issues with phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, then through the requiring them to explain why they might have made those errors, diagnosing, the students themselves developing the ability to self-assess their reading, identify what might have gone wrong, and that's a way to assess those aspects, those important components or dimensions of reading. And I just want to steal a second just to comment on another question my eyes flashed on just a minute ago with regard to deaf students. I must do that because of my passion in working with deaf students, so forgive me. But deaf students struggle a lot with reading assessments, but deaf students have to learn to read. They live in a bilingual environment, and the English, written English, they need to develop competencies. But that's where formative assessments will prepare them for those final assessments that involve a lot of reading of written text. So, for example, I can determine whether my deaf students can answer questions by doing formative assessment of text, having them respond using their sign language. And then I can now work with them to develop those competencies that will help them when they're actually managing written text in an exam to respond appropriately. So deaf students have to read, and the only way we can develop their reading competencies to perform well in formative assessments that lead to those final assessments where we have evidence of their learning is early intervention. So that and giving them, using that bilingual curricula that allows them to tap into what they've learned through their first language, to learn to read and write in their second language, which is English, in our case.
Wonderful answer, Dr. Scarrett, and we know that is your passion. So thank you for addressing that that constituency in inverted commas, as it were. So for the last 2 hours or so, we've been looking at pardon me, we've been looking at transforming we started with Dr. James, who led us through transforming what's required for transforming the education system. And then we looked at, we had Professor Delisle take us through the need for assessment system that empowers learners. We then looked at the criteria that are necessary for setting up a formative assessment system. We looked at and explored principles for ensuring authentic reading assessment. And Dr. Louison brought us to a rather dreadful close, if I might say so myself, very scary close by sharing with us successful intervention tips using psychoeducational and formative assessment data. We have been with you for the last 2 hours. It has been an enjoyable experience, I must say, listening to at least from my end, listening to my colleagues' expertise. And we hope that you have enjoyed it and that it has been worth your while. So let me just make a plug for the next webinar, which is on Wednesday. We will also have 5 speakers there on Wednesday, this Wednesday coming, and we'll be looking at the following topics: employing instructionally sensitive large-scale assessments in mathematics, rubrics, exhibitions, and projects, tips on how to assess transversal skills using the FSI model. Then we look at the FSI model, is it for me? An FSI virtual panel, that's the one we promise you, where you can hear from the voices of teachers, classroom teachers. There'll be a session called Modeling Formative Assessment Change, the emergent role of PLCs for professional learning and teacher change. And the final one will be, what is the way forward for education recovery? A new vision for creating deeper learning in the Trinidad and Tobago classroom. So those are our topics for Wednesday's session. We begin at 4:30 and we'll finish punctually at 6:30. We thank you very much for having joined us this afternoon. We hope, some of you had asked about the recording, we hope to be able to provide that in a short time. I can't say exactly when, but we do thank you for being here and for having participated so fully, for having asked such wonderful questions that have engaged the expertise of the panel. So on behalf of the team, on behalf of our director and the panelists, we thank you very much. And we bid you good evening until Wednesday. Thank you and good evening.